Good morning. I'm Pastor Jane Gingrich, and I serve Hills of Peace Lutheran Church here in Kamloops, British Columbia.
I'm Pastor John Boyd, and I serve St. George's Anglican Parish here in Kamloops, British Columbia.
As a clergy couple, we have many conversations throughout the week, but record one of them to share here and invite you into dialogue on Thursday mornings. And each week we have a different topic, and this week our topic is honoring and remembering. As this will be shared on YouTube on Remembrance Day here in Canada, we are thinking that would be an excellent topic to approach from a pastoral and theological perspective. And so here we are. Thinking about how we want to be remembered, how we honor those in our communities. Are there traditions or historical remembrances that are part of the life and community at St. George's?
Yes, this year for Remembrance Day, we had a different format than what we're used to. Normally, we invite either members of the Air Cadets or a veteran. Members of the Rocky Mountain Rangers usually have come in as well. And it's wonderful to have that connection and presence with the community and the active core of servicemen and women with Canada Forces, just so that we're reminded that there are people who have vocational offices that serve in capacities of defense and caretaking and these things, and that we need to be mindful of prayer as something that's given for the entire world in a variety of different diverse capacities and identities. So this year, because of COVID restrictions, what we had were intentional pieces at the start of the service before announcements in the liturgy, where O Canada, our national anthem, was played, and there was also a time of silence. And that set the tone a little bit for the start of liturgy, which was good, so that people were aware that we were going to recognize Remembrance Day. And the other bits were pieces that were taken from the actual national communal liturgy, the Book of Alternative Services, and those pieces that are specifically dedicated for commemoration of the dead, and things like the Collect for All Saints that are appropriate liturgically for this situation, just so that it had that theme that was constantly drawing people back in to remembrance, to prayer through remembrance, and what we hope for in terms of peace and eternal rest for ourselves and for all those who've gone before us. And also, really quickly, I should mention the intentional pieces in the prayers of the people were incredibly important for calling to mind Remembrance Day and what we were praying for on that day as well. That's what we were able to do this year with our situation. How about for Hills of Peace?
Absolutely. In other years, and especially as we had the 100th anniversary recently, and this year being the 75th year since the ending of the war, there were many things we would have liked to have done this year that in other years we've had a display, including photos, memorabilia, medals from either congregation members or relatives of members, which have drawn to mind and made it that much more vivid and present for us to recognize those who have been part of our history and require and need that we continue to honor them, recognizing all that has been given for us to live as we do. This year, in addition to recognizing the history, we also put some intention into including first responders and people on the front lines at this time through COVID, because so many are in essence fighting for us right now. And while it is not the same, and certainly we do not wish to diminish in any capacity the efforts and service of veterans and those who have served abroad or in times of war, in addition to that, I think it's important to recognize that so many first responders and frontline workers are also in need of some way of honoring as we remember and recognize all that has been given in these months and over the last year. And so that was included as well as your naming as part of the liturgy and in the prayers this last week. But beyond that, I think honoring and remembering extends not just for this time of Remembrance Day, but we are moving into a season now in the middle of November, probably from right about now actually, right through until January, where I believe it is every faith tradition has some kind of a celebration, commemoration, time of remembrance, honoring, or festivity. And as we are thinking of the ways that we remember and honor those who have served us, those who have been part of our history, part of the cultural identity of who we are in community, it's also a time that we are moving into honoring and remembering our own historical faith traditions as well, and where all of the different pieces of perhaps liturgy, but certainly a sense of community, and within Christianity, the draw to worship and the call to be part of God's people happens in the coming weeks. And so thinking about that, I think of all of the ways we would be intending to gather for events, Christmas dinner, Advent soup lunch, all kinds of ways that we would be offering social opportunities, which are also part of the tradition when you're part of a faith community typically. But that much more important, I think, then are the traditions that relate to what it means to be a person of faith. And as we were talking about the potential of this topic, I think some of that was coming to mind for you in terms of how we are formed, and that there is an honoring and remembering that happens every time we gather. But why don't I let you speak some more about that?
Yeah, I'd like to touch on that aspect of our faith, especially its connection to the Eucharist. But I want to reflect on what you've just said about all of the here and now contextual events that are happening in the way in which time and our lives are being marked now in all of the events that you're saying. And I think I'll bring us into the Eucharist, but I want to stay with that as well, because one of the things I was thinking about as we were talking is how subconscious all of these events are in terms of creating memories and creating almost an indexed system in our brain that's related to the whole body sensorial experience of sight, sound, and touch, and all these things. And we're going through that every day as we live through this pandemic, and as our life changes, we're starting to create these memories, and it's processing not just what we know, but it's also shaping our future and present ways of looking and understanding the life and reality and our experiences of faith and our understanding of who God is right now. And I know that's obvious, but I don't want to lose that framework as we go into talking more about this, to open up the questions with people who are watching and with the discussion group. There's a French historian, Pierre Nora, and I'll probably get the French term wrong, so please correct it. But he wrote a lot about something that he calls lieu de mémoire.
The place of memory?
Places of memory and memory sites, yeah. And the way in which he spoke about that is, and we see them every day as like monuments, especially in the States. We're talking about Memorial Day and remembering and things like that, and the connection, of course, to servicemen and women and people who served our country in various capacities. That takes on a whole different ethos in the States, which I know we don't want to get too much into, but we know just by saying that the difference between the way Canada remembers and the way that the States remembers. And I grew up in the States, but it is true that there are these things, these events and these places that become so saturated with our cultural collective experience of an event, that all we have to do is mention them. Like for Canada, all we have to do is say the word Passchendaele, and everybody immediately knows what we're talking about, or, Vimy Ridge, and bang, we're all there, and there's a whole story behind that. And that is a site of memory, and that shapes our identity, it shapes our thinking, it shapes our reality in the world. And from that perspective, when we then look at what we're talking about as Christians, and this act of remembering, especially in the Eucharist, when we declare the mystery of our faith, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ has come again. When Paul talks about the apostolic tradition in 1 Corinthians 11 and 15, when we get to the central heart of the words of institution, whenever you drink of this, do this in remembrance of me. Whenever you eat of this, do this in remembrance of me. Remembering, therefore, his life-giving passion, death, and resurrection. It is through the act of remembering that somehow, through God's promises, the presence of God is there with us then and there in that moment. And time has sort of crossed and been fulfilled. We're not aware of it because we're all kind of looking at what's going on in the present. But spiritually speaking, from a perspective of faith, we've crossed into memory, and the past, the present, and the future kind of converge. And I think there are ways in which we experience memory, especially on days like Remembrance Day, where, especially for the people who've lived through it, and I think we need to be conscious of this as we support each other and love each other through COVID, that they will be remembering things, and their memories will be so saturated and so real for them that a lot of them will be there in those experiences again, even though they know they're here and now. And I think the same thing is true for frontline workers. So, yeah, are there ways in which we found support in the community to help people through remembering in these memory sites?
Well, typically offering a time of ceremony would be a big piece. And there is a Remembrance Day ceremony that was put together by the interfaith chaplains or multi-faith chaplains at TRU that's available on YouTube and on the Hills of Peace Facebook page today. However, in our community, there isn't the opportunity for gathering in Kamloops this year. And there is space being carved out for those who have been participants and veterans in various places around the world. And so that space is being held for people who have served. However, you're right. These memories and what will come back to folks through this day affects more than those who were abroad and served.
Yeah.
And so engaging in some time of prayer, time perhaps of devotion, reading something from the Bible that would offer a sense of hope, I think would be very important on a day where that sense of remembering that can typically be done in community as part of a ceremony or an event in the wider community is not possible, that each of us might feel that sense of isolation that much more starkly again, because, as you say, this is a cultural national event together, and while we are not able to be present physically as we normally would be, we still need to honor that space for ourselves too.
Yeah.
And so I think that's an important piece to note. Did you want to say more about what you're thinking or ideas for how a person might?
No, I think you've hit exactly what I would stress, is that reaching out to one another through this as well, and finding those resources and realizing and becoming familiar with the liturgical resources of the church that are already there for us, and asking for guidance and for help from people who are familiar with those resources, like lay ministers of word and sacrament, people who write the prayers of the people, and who are very familiar in our own parishes, that have the vocations and the skills and the life experience that can point us all in a direction of support. And I did very quickly, and then I should wrap it up, but the thing I also wanted to say is that while we're talking about Remembrance Day, because of what we're talking about, I'm saying I think there will come a time very soon in our future where the event of COVID itself and some of the things that we've experienced together in community will also have that same need. That there may be a day of remembering
Exactly.
what happened with COVID and having liturgies around this particular pandemic and what we came through as a church and as a community and as a people. So, yeah.
Very much so. And I think looking ahead to December, where we're offering a service of hope and healing in December ahead of Christmas time, which should typically be for people who have experienced loss in this last year, those who are struggling as a result of the season. Often it's called a blue Christmas. This year, that is very much the focus, is recognizing that we are all in a different state this year, and that it's important to still leave room for grieving and honoring that challenge to each of us so that we can continue on and see hopefulness ahead of us. And so in thinking about honoring and remembering, not just as a piece of Remembrance Day, but in our daily liturgical lives as people of faith, you were going to say something about the Eucharist.
Yeah, I would just say, as I said about the Eucharist already, that act of remembering to just keep in mind that what we are remembering, even in those few lines, is so rich with experience.
I see what you mean.
That it recalls a whole history, it recalls our whole lives in faith. We have a tendency to talk about that in negative ways now, too, where we talk about things that are triggers, because we've been talking an awful lot about trauma and being careful of triggering people. And so I know that that's a language that people are familiar with. So I wanted to say that there are certain triggers, or there are certain keywords and phrases and symbols that are also triggers in the Eucharist, but somehow we can see those as not having negative meaning. It does recall trauma. Dirk Lang, who's a liturgist, wrote an amazing book on the Eucharist and this whole aspect of memory called Trauma Recalled. That act of remembering is what transforms suffering and what transforms the pain and the horror of it all, because we then can see God at work bringing us through it, bringing us to new life and to peace, and that's also what's happening in Remembrance Day as well.
And you named exactly where I think it's important to go with this, that so often there is still a sense that peace is overlooked on Remembrance Day. And while we are expressing our gratitude and honoring and remembering, I think what is being upheld above all else is peace. And so as we are thinking about what it means to be people of faith in a time of global pandemic, the most important care that we offer and share with one another is the hope of peace.
Yes.
Because the anxiety, the fear, the unknown, the misinformation and confusion of information and orders and protocols and distance and isolation lead to a deeper sense of unrest, a greater sense of vulnerability. And the antidote or other side of that is what Christ offers in arriving among the fearful disciples, in greeting and breathing upon those whom he loves with peace be with you. And so that too might be one of the most important ways that we can honor and remember on this day this year, is to connect with those in our community, maybe with a phone call, maybe with an email, and share that greeting. Peace be with you. Remembering that that is the greatest of gifts we have, offered, given, and sacrificed for by so many. And yet we still have that gift today, even despite and through a global pandemic. So, peace be with you. And thank you for listening. We'll see you tomorrow, Thursday morning from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. The Zoom link is on Hills of Peace Lutheran Church Facebook page and has been emailed to be shared with you. See you then.